Hello, and thank you for viewing our webcast today. This webcast is sponsored by the Effective Evaluation Resource Center, and my name's Ginger, and I am a project coordinator at the Effective Evaluation Resource Center. Today we have Dr. Samuel Ortiz speaking with us, and he is from St. John's University in New York, and he has areas of research and expertise which include bilingual, cross-cultural, non-discriminatory assessment, CHC cross-battery assessment, intelligence theory and evaluation of learning disabilities, language proficiency and acculturation and their impact on intelligence testing, cultural competence, and educational methodology for English language learners. And he also has a recent book out, Assessment of Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Students, A Practical Guide, and Essentials of Cross-Battery Assessment, 3rd edition. So there's a little introduction on Dr. Ortiz, and he is going to take over the microphone and lead us through our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ginger. Appreciate the introduction very much, and welcome to any of you who are new to the recording this time around, or those of you who didn't quite hear very well last time. Welcome back. I know that many of you have probably already had some instruction, some training and education in working with English language learners. So I'm not doing an extensive presentation today on those particular issues. I'm more going to give you some of the basics in terms of what might constitute a good process or an approach, or a best practice approach, and go through some case studies which will allow you to sort of begin to understand how you can begin and engage in evaluations of children who are culturally and linguistically diverse that really, I think, stands up to both, I would say, not only good practice, but defensible practice, both from a legal as well as from a practice standpoint. So I think, I'll begin there, and I hope it's not too much of a jump, but in the end we'll have some questions, and if things aren't very clear, hopefully some of the questions will take care of that, and we shall see. So I think that it's important to recognize what is it that causes the difficulties in evaluating children who are culturally and linguistically different. And it really boils down to a simple question. When you're asked to evaluate, you're given this task to look at this child's functioning, look at their capabilities, look at their academic achievement, and then determine whether or not the learning problems that are manifest in the classroom or that have been observed, those that were used to prompt the referral for even evaluation, are those problems due primarily to cultural or linguistic differences or an actual disorder? And that's something that is, I think, at the heart of evaluation with diverse populations. And the reason is that if the test performance is influenced primarily by these factors, well, then the learning problems are due to those issues, which basically means it's a difference. It's a difference in the child's development. It's a difference in the child's experience, a difference in the child's acculturative learning and or developmental language proficiency, to be specific. So differences are not disabilities, and of course under IDEA you can't qualify a child as having a disability if in fact there is no disability. So that's what you're sort of up against. On the other hand, if the test performance is not due entirely or even primarily to cultural linguistic differences, that is, if these factors are present, which they are in the cases that you're working with, but they can only be demonstrated to be contributory influences. In other words, they're not the primary reason why this child is having trouble in the classroom, then it means that the child may in fact have a disability, or if you can identify a disability in that case, that is responsible primarily for the learning difficulties, then that's a child who can or may have an actual disability of some type or disorder of some type. So the issue in ELL evaluations is wrestling with this particular question. The test performance, the results that you generate from your testing need to be a reflection of the child's actual ability, or a lack of ability, as it were, because we're dealing with disability. And the test results cannot be due primarily to these external or extrinsic factors, such as the developmental lags that occur when a child is not from the dominant culture, not being raised in the dominant culture, doesn't have as much experience with the dominant culture, likewise is not, say, learning English from birth, is not hearing English as he or she is growing up, and is not necessarily coming to school with the same level of language development as other children, in English that is. So those are the kinds of things that we need to be aware of and we need to be thinking about, because this is the sort of the obstacle we have to get over. This is the hurdle we must jump if we're going to be able to work with children effectively. In engaging in the process, one of the things I often recommend is that you think about how different the child is. When you go to evaluate, as you're going to see with some of the case studies examples here, you must know the degree of difference that exists in that child's background experiences, background and developmental experiences. And the more different the child is, the more likely there's an effect on his or her performance in school. You know, and that's just a simple kind of concept. If you are not being raised with the elements of a particular culture, and then that culture asks you to identify those elements in the culture, such as might happen on a vocabulary test, for example, you may not, probably will not, be as familiar with them as other students who have been raised in that culture, simply because you've not been exposed to them, they've not been a part of your upbringing or a part of your experience. That doesn't mean that you have a disability, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong, it simply means your experiences have been different. The same thing holds true with language, and what I've listed here on this particular slide are some of those things that constitute these types of differences. So when you look at, you know, a child and you're evaluating them, you need to gather information if you haven't already done so. The pre-referral process is a perfect place to gather this information. If you're engaging in an RTI process, besides the progress monitoring data, knowledge of the child's background is crucially important. So you probably have already gathered this information. And that would include things like the parents and or the student's proficiency in their own native language and in English. Now, you may have test scores for the student. You wouldn't have test scores for the parent, but for the student, you might have test scores upon entry. But what are the current test scores? You know, you really, I'd say from K through 3, you should have data on language proficiency for the child in English, probably even for their in their own native language, no older than about 6 months because of the rapid progress from there. After that, yearly is probably okay. But from K through 3, you want to have more recent data. And the parent's proficiency level in their own native language is important, and you may not be able to gauge that quantitatively, but through an interview you can simply ask and get an idea. And the purpose of that is to understand what kind of language models the child is hearing at home, the degree of language development that might have existed in the home, and so on, and in what language it might have occurred. So, you know, again, the basic trajectory for an English learner is they don't hear much, if any, English before they start school. Then when they start school, they start hearing English and start learning and are expected to be learning in English, which is a tough task. And this is what creates that delay. It's not that they have a disability in learning the language, they simply are starting at a different point than everybody else. Understanding the nature and the type of the student's educational program is very important. Getting ESL or ESOL services, are they getting any kind of native language instruction through a transitional or a maintenance bilingual program? Are they in a dual language or dual immersion type program? These are things that can affect the child's development. For example, a child being raised in one language at home and then starts school and gets educated in that language as well as perhaps in English, but at least core subject matter in the native language or concurrently with English as well. But if that's occurring, then that child's development in language is not being interrupted. Neither is necessarily their acculturative experiences, because a lot of the content will come to them in their native language. So they're being taught in a way that is consistent with the development they bring in. If they get ESL or ESL only, or if they get no services, God forbid, then what happens is we're expecting a child to start from scratch. We're saying, well, I know that you were learning one language, but now I want you to learn in a different language. And remember, to learn in a language, you have to understand the instruction. It has to be made comprehensible to you. How comprehensible will it be if you don't even understand what's being said? And this, again, creates developmental delays and lags that are not inherent to the child, but are circumstantial in nature, not reflective of disabilities, but reflective of differences. Parents and students' knowledge of the dominant U.S. culture, again, this is just looking at what kind of things a child is learning about at home, what types of things is the child being exposed to, all the kinds of things that we tend to ask, especially on cognitive ability and intelligence tests, have a lot to do with culture. And the language itself is intertwined with culture in a way that it's difficult to separate them, which means that the language they're learning often dictates the culture they're learning, and therefore their knowledge of culture is following accordingly. Family socioeconomic status. Families where children are growing up in, say, with middle class or higher kind of SES are likely to do well in school. So socioeconomic status mediates that issue. In fact, you could have children who are absolutely considered to be white and native English speakers, such as might occur in Appalachia in the Carolinas. I go there often to present. And these children are not, so to speak, culturally and linguistically diverse, but in fact they are both culturally and linguistically diverse, primarily because the socioeconomic status and the situation in which they live is isolated culturally, and it's economically very, very disadvantaged, and it creates many of these kinds of problems. So just by virtue of the fact that the child's family is not well off will be something that will mitigate their ability to progress through school, to learn a new language, and to succeed. Child's formal and informal educational experiences in terms of what they've been through. And again, knowing what kind of programs they might have had, especially if the child is transferring into your school for the first time, is very, very important. How much education have they had before they came to your school? Was it in their native language? Was it here in the U.S.? Was it in their native country? These are things you must know in order to determine that kind of difference. How many absences have they had, especially with migrant families? Are they missing a lot of school? And then finally, just their living situation, the home experiences during the student's life. You really want to look at anything that is very unusual. Well, I don't mean very unusual, but just unusual. When you think of the typical child that we evaluate, we're talking about generally, parents in the home. We're talking about stability. We're talking about enough food. We're talking about enough clothing, shelter, not worrying about the basic kinds of needs. There are families where, that is a big concern. And there are families who come from backgrounds, especially immigrant families, where they might have endured living in refugee camps for a long period of time, where they may have existed in societies or countries where there was war, and this is a part of their existence. There may be children who have moved repeatedly to different places, have been instructed in different languages at different times. These are things, again, that are very, very unusual, but that are extremely important for understanding what constitutes difference. As you're going to see when I start speaking later on about the Culture Language Matrix, it's predicated upon a simple notion of difference. So it's distilled down to either just different or moderately different, which would be the typical child, or markedly different, which would be a very unusual child, or a child who's just arrived, or a child who's only slightly different, a child who probably speaks English very, very well, but there is still an element of difference there. So understanding these things is very important for now to be able to make sense of whether or not your results, when you do test, were affected by cultural and linguistic variables. So as you can see here in this slide, the more differences that exist, the more severe they are, the more they will negatively affect test performance. And as I said previously, when your obtained test results really reflect the measurement of these cultural and linguistic variables, that means you did not measure what it is you wanted to measure. that means the constructs that you're trying to measure, you know, if we put it in CHC terms, if you're trying to measure visual processing, you're trying to measure auditory processing or short-term memory, long-term storage retrieval, and so forth, then if your results were affected by culture and language more than anything else, your results are not valid. You cannot then say, well, here is this child's auditory processing ability, and here is this child's fluid reasoning ability. You have very limited, if any, interpretability when your results are not valid, and you cannot assign specific meaning to your scores. On the other hand, if the results that you obtain are only, say, partially influenced by the presence of cultural linguistic variables, or maybe not even at all, but that would be rare, culture and language are going to be there to some degree. The question is, are they there to a sufficient degree to invalidate your results, or are they there only to what is called a contributory degree? And this is a very important word, especially for your reports. Culture and language factors are not going to disappear when you test, but they may only be contributory factors to the child's learning problems. As such, if they're only contributory, you have the ability to determine whether or not something else is primary. And if something else is primary, such as a disability, then that's a child who, albeit being an ELL, still may qualify for special education services. So that's the key. You want to make sure that your results are not primarily the result of culture and language, and that if culture and language are there, they are at best considered to be contributory factors. If they're contributory, then your results may be deemed to be valid, and they can be interpreted and assigned specific meaning. There is, you know, one caveat, which I'll explain a little bit later, and that's related to the measurement of GC. But you won't have to use, and you notice I put even without extreme caution in here. When people often write this, they really just say that almost as some kind of absolution, like, okay, you know, I know that this child is culturally and linguistically different, but, you know, that means we should interpret the results with extreme caution. And then people just go and interpret as they ordinarily would. There is no such thing as extreme caution interpretation. There is interpretation, or there isn't interpretation. And so by looking at your results and determining the effect or the impact of culture and language, when it's not the primary reason for the results you obtained, you can go back and evaluate, and interpret as you ordinarily would, with the exception of GC. And I'll point that out a little bit later, but I'll explain it a little bit now. GC, or crystallized intelligence, it's called sometimes, or comprehension and knowledge, is culture and language. So GC is a measure directly of language development. It's a measure of cultural knowledge. That's what it is. It's, by definition, those things. So it's not possible to eliminate the influence of culture and language from the measurement of culture and language on a test designed to measure culture and language. They go together. So in that case, for that ability and nothing else, okay, only that one ability, the appropriate, say, comparison level should not be to the mainstream, which would be mean of 100, but in fact should be as compared to other children of the same cultural linguistic background. And you can use the cultural language matrix to make that determination, which I will show you later. So as you can see here, the central question in any evaluation of English language learners is predicated upon the concept of validity, not reliability, not whether you're measuring things accurately or not, but whether you're measuring what you think you're measuring. And when we can determine that what we measured is what we think we measured, then we are safe in being able to say, okay, I'm going to interpret my results. But when we can determine that what we measured was not the abilities that we intended, but in fact ended up being the effect of culture and language, then our results are not valid, and we will not move forward with interpretation beyond a couple of things that can be said. All right, so I want to move into the cases here. And we have three of them, Marco, Jacob, and David, 2 8-year-olds and a 5-year-old, first grader, third grader, and a kindergarten. And each one has something that's a little bit different than the other. So I'm going to walk you through them and guide you in terms of what was said, what has been said, information that has been gathered, some things that have been determined. And then I'm going to show you how to apply the cultural language matrix and being able to sort of address the question. Unfortunately, in terms of the way that the cases have been done, it's not it may not be the correct order, or there may not be entirely enough information to be able to say this is how it was done or this is how it should have been done. But I'll try and clarify as I go along to make it make sense for you. And at least I think you'll get an idea about where we're going with this and what it all means. And I'm sure you'll be able to apply it in terms of the practices that you engage in as well. So I'm going to start with Marco here. And you can see Marco was retained in kindergarten when he was at his previous school. And he has been in a school that is doing RTI. And he's getting small group instruction at this point, so probably either Tier 2, maybe Tier 3 even. And yet he's not progressing. Now, again, the concept of progressing, you know, we might address if we had time in terms of the rates that are occurring. Are they being compared to the baseline or aim lines for children who are native English speakers or other children who are like Marco? That's for another time, but that's basically what you'd want to have. And we'll assume in this case that that he wasn't progressing as would be expected, even when compared to children who are culturally and linguistically different. Now, what's interesting in his case, though, is that initially at the time of the referral for assessment, it was thought that he was not an English language learner, but upon review, it was determined that in fact Spanish is the primary language spoken in the home. So this necessitated a follow-up, which kind of complicates this case a little bit. And that is that the verbal portion of the cognitive assessment was then re-administered in Spanish. Now, I think this practice here is more of a concession to IDEA than it is to good practice or necessary practice in evaluation, because we know that IDEA says if a child is still designated as limited English proficient, they're still getting ESL or ESL service, they have not been exited yet, that they need to be evaluated in the language and form that is most likely to yield accurate results. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be in a native language, but on the other hand, that's usually how it's interpreted. And so that's probably why this was done here, or it was done to just generate additional information. The reason that this provision in IDEA is a little bit vague and a little bit ambiguous is this. Why would we test Marco in Spanish anyway, especially in terms of his development, when we know he's never been educated in Spanish? He's being educated in English. The development of the kinds of cognitive abilities that we're most likely to be interested in, particularly fluid reasoning, particularly language and culture, which is GC, two of the biggest G-loaded types of tests, they're not going to be progressing as we would expect because he's not being educated in Spanish, and we began his development again when he started kindergarten because we started him in English at that point. So in a sense, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to go ahead and evaluate in Spanish for that reason. When does it make sense would be when you've determined that testing in English has uncovered a problem and that problem is not due to cultural and linguistic factors. That's when you would go back probably and say, all right, let me do some of this evaluation in the native language, and I would focus on the areas in which there was difficulty, areas in which the English evaluation indicated here are some possible areas of actual dysfunction, and then the native language evaluation would help to validate and confirm that these areas are in fact problematic. And again, it's not that we would expect a child to be at normative levels even in Spanish, again, given the differences in development, but it could provide information regarding whether or not they're at or they're having difficulty in those areas. In fact, at that point, the native language testing would probably be administered primarily for qualitative reasons, not for quantitative reasons, since the scores might not be valid anyway, since the norm samples are not necessarily appropriate for the bilingual kids we have here in the U.S., and because, again, the child is not necessarily being educated in the native language. So that said, the results, as we're going to see, are a little bit difficult to sort of interpret because they reflect somewhat of a blend of the native language testing as well as the English language testing. And of course, it was acknowledged here that language abilities may have impacted the results of this assessment. So the key is if you believe that language abilities may have impacted the results of assessment, you need to answer that question, because if it did, you shouldn't be saying anything about the results. If it didn't, or not sufficiently, then you should say, well, you looked at that issue and determined that it did not affect it substantially, and therefore your results stand and are considered valid. So here's what was presented again in the report in terms of his test results. He was administered the entire WISC-IV in English. At a later point in time, he was given, again, the verbal subtest in Spanish. So that's primarily, I guess, the verbal comprehension scale that you can see there. So, the results here apparently are indicative of the Spanish verbal assessment, but the perceptual reasoning, working memory, processing speed indexes are from the English testing. I think it would have been great to have the English one here or in parentheses or alongside of it for comparison purposes, because as you'll see, it would have been easier to evaluate what's going on here. Of course, the person who did this could easily go back and substitute the other scores and proceed in the way that I'm about to show you. But here are the results, and everything looks fairly low, borderline, 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 and a low average. So naturally, it looks like there's a significant problem here. Now, as you move forward and you look at the summary that was provided in this evaluation, again, saying that he's an 8-year-old second-grade student in elementary school, referred for evaluation through the RTI process. And then it says he is currently functioning in the borderline range of intellectual ability. Now, I would not write that particular part. I don't think it's appropriate to state that unless and until you've determined that your results are valid. The other thing that I'm concerned about that is that his score is not likely to reflect what his overall true ability is, even if most of the scores most of his scores were valid, primarily because some of the scores are going to bring that result down as the influence of culture and language are present in the varying degrees on different tests. So I don't know, I just might not do that particular part of it. However, it says most of the assessment was completed in English, so the overall achievements were interpreted with caution. And that's where, again, I'm saying rather than interpret with caution, which is no caution, I would say that's not what you want to say in the first place. Now, even with the Spanish administration of verbal subtest, it says he struggled considerably. And here's where I think mistakes can be made easily. If you assume that the English results are valid, and then you test in the native language and you find that, oh, they're low as well, then you tend to confirm what you started with. But we don't know that the testing in English was valid, and the testing in Spanish can't be substituted for the English, because then there's no way to actually or completely evaluate the results. So, yes, his cognitive skills seem to be significantly impacted, but I'm still not clear at this point whether that's because of cultural linguistic differences or whether that's because he, in fact, is low. So if we continue on, all right, here are results that were presented, and in this case, these are called cohesive results because I think the person was following cross-battery principles, and so either additional testing was done or the indexes were derived by using scores that would produce the cohesive indexes, which my guess would be that some of them might have come from the Spanish language testing. So while this makes sense psychometrically, it doesn't yet make sense unless we've determined that culture and language were something that were not primarily influencing the child's actual scores. So what's being done here is not necessarily incorrect. It's just I'm concerned more about the order. You can see here that we get the not cohesive kinds of results, and they're very small differences. If I go back and if you just look at the verbal comprehension index, you basically see a 6, a 3, and a 9 for similarities, vocabulary, and comprehension. If I go back, it's a 6, 5, and a 6. So in a sense, the vocabulary and comprehension have changed. Right there, you can see it, and then over here, they're different. I'm wondering, whether I don't know, so it's difficult to say which scores were taken from the English testing, which scores were taken from the native language testing. And that's why it's not something you want to do. How do you then interpret what's going on here? Was there additional testing done if there was, or if it was supplemented, why is comprehension still listed instead of some other subtest if that was a different one, and vocabulary still listed if it was replaced by something else? So I don't know what to make of it. And when you have results like this, I don't see them as being particularly defensible. So you don't want to jump the gun here and say, well, here's what I have and here's what's going on. Really, the first thing you want to do is look at the results in the Cultural Language Matrix. Now, I took the liberty of taking the subtest from both the cohesive and the non-cohesive and putting them through the matrix. But once again, I'm at a loss a little bit because I don't know if I'm still mixing things, but I suspect I am, but I'll go ahead and do the analysis anyway. The point of the Cultural Language Interpretive Matrix is simply to determine whether or not your results are due more to culture and language than anything else. And if they're not, then your results are valid, then you go interpret, with the one exception of GC that I was talking about before. So in this case, if I put the subtest scores into the C-LIM here, you can see the scores, 85 here, which is this, that one is 79, 75, 80, 82 down here, and the 78 in the bottom right-hand corner. And we kind of see a decline, but not too much. If I look at it in terms of, let me go back here. If I look at it in terms of the decline, a little bit, probably not as much as I'd like to see. Now, there's a question here, and I'm going to let Virginia ask.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ortiz. This is just a question from one of our participants when we did this webinar the first time, and she wanted to ask, can you speak more about the meaning of each bar and typical trends for the C-LIM graph? Oops, I think you just need to turn your audio on.
That's a great question, and I'm going to answer that in terms of the graph that is generated from the data that I was just showing you with Marco. So here's his data from the cohesive results that were there, and here's what we have. Now, what the graph does is it's really just a portrayal of the aggregate scores that were shown on the Cultural Language Interpretive Matrix. The gray bar that's in the center here is the shaded region that is used to portray the expected range, or the the dotted line represents the average. The gray shading represents more like a standard error of measure. But the dotted line represents the average performance of individuals who are moderately different, and that's what sort of I determined in Marco's case here. And what their expected pattern of decline would be across the subtests given to him in terms of those which are on the far left-hand side, and it says low, low, or low language, low culture, to those on the far right-hand side where it says high, high, which is high cultural loading, high linguistic demand. And basically, we know from research that's been conducted for over the past 100 years that basically when tests are low in terms of cultural loading and linguistic demand, performance is higher. But when tests require more cultural, say, knowledge and they require more language development in English, then the performance is lower. Now, this works primarily when testing is done in English only. We have some development going on at the moment with native language tests, but really there isn't sufficient evidence to say we have an evidence base to point at in terms of making those kinds of comparisons. And certainly we don't want to mix the results up here. And what you see here is basically, if you look at these cells, they're not, the bars are not in the gray shaded region in all cases. It's not up here on the again, extreme left or in the middle, and the ones on the right are, but the ones on the left are not. We would expect that if culture and language could explain these results in their entirety, then the ones on the far left would be much higher, the ones in the middle would be at least into that gray area, and the ones on the right would be where they are. So is culture and language present in this case? Yes. Now, I mean, even in these results, there's some effect of culture and language. But does it explain everything? No, it probably does not. So in this case, we could use the graph to basically say our results are likely valid. In other words, culture and language cannot not explain the whole of these results, which means it did not invalidate our results. So we are free now to move ahead and say our results may be affected somewhat by culture and language, but only to a contributory degree. And something else is causing these scores to be what they are. So therefore, I am going to go back and I'm going to interpret as I ordinarily would. And that's the sort of the procedure and the order in which you want to follow it. Use this to evaluate your results, your subtest scores that is, first, before you really make any determination about what your scores actually mean. So the thing that concerns me about this case, though, is I don't know that there aren't Spanish language tests in here. I don't know if that helped elevate this or something else, because if these were lower down here, you could see a decline. And if he were maybe a very low average student, it might indicate, in fact, that he was, or his results were affected by culture and language more than anything else. If I look at his not cohesive results, and again, I don't know if there's a mixture of things going on there, but these are the scores taken from those subtests put into the Culture Language Matrix once again. And this is what it looks like. And one more time, if we move to the graph for this particular case, it looks somewhat like this. Now, in this case, you do see that he performed much better up here. This did not change, although I know that this may have been probably like it was in the native language again, so I'm not sure. On the other hand, if I consider Marco in his background to be markedly different, he'd be much closer to being where we would expect. And that's why it's important to determine where he is relative to other English learners. We know he's in 3rd grade, so he's not been in the country for very, very long. He's not certainly been in school long enough to develop any form of CALP, and of course he's not being educated in the native language whatsoever. I don't know, enough about his family's background, so I don't know what their socioeconomic status is. Like I said, all I know is that they thought he wasn't an English learner, but then turns out he absolutely was. So he may be more moderately different, was my sense. But if he were more markedly different, we might have a different impression in this case in terms of where his development would be, and that's why it's important to know them. So in this case, again, although I can see that, yes, culture and language are operating on the far left, culture and language is operating on the far right, in the middle we still don't have scores that are probably getting up to the level that they should. And again, depending upon how different we would think he would be. In the next version of the Cultural Language Matrix, the software that's coming out, this gray bar will be user adjustable. Okay, so you won't actually have to do any math and try to figure out, what's the difference range if he was markedly different and so on. All you have to do is click a button and it'll move the gray band either to be where the red one is now or to be higher above it, which is where a slightly different pattern would be. So you're actually able to test hypotheses related to difference if you want to, and you can move that sort of automatically. And the bars, again, or the shaded areas, simply represent the expected pattern of decline that would occur for this particular or these particular subtests that were administered for individuals who have cultural and linguistic backgrounds that are either moderately different, as I described previously, or markedly different if it's very unusual or the child hasn't been here very long, or if it's only slightly different. So it'll help, I think, clarify in the future. In this case, I think that perhaps some of the conclusions that were drawn were probably valid. I don't think there's a speech-language problem because, again, no matter whether he's tested in English or even the native language, I think he was within this gray range here. And that's where a GC ought to be considered. And GC tests will always be in the far right-hand column on the graph. They can't be anywhere else because they are automatically and by definition high in language, high in culture, and that's where they're going to fall. So that's where you would see them. And as long as they fall in that gray shaded area, I'm going to say that any speech language functioning, any cultural knowledge, any learning or language development has got to be within normal limits because it is comparable to other English language learners. Other than that is where I'm going to look for my areas of difficulties. And so in this case, I wouldn't look for it in the verbal comprehension index, for example. I might look for it in the other areas which could be related to processing speed and or working memory, which is what I think was actually stated in this particular case. So I think the person who did this evaluation got to the correct answer, not necessarily in the correct order. And I think the correct order for doing things is important because it helps establish the defensibility, both from a legal standpoint as well as from a best practice standpoint in terms of what was done. And it also helps ensure replicability so that somebody else coming through looking at these data would be able to come to the same conclusion. And that's what I think creates a truly defensible kind of evaluation and or report. All right. The next case is Jacob. And as you can see here, Jacob has a lot of information. He was referred for initial evaluation by his teacher. There were concerns expressed regarding a lack of progress, especially in reading, and he's got poor grades. Now, it says here, background information, mother completed social developmental history form, and I wrote in there, and, question mark, because this is the information that is crucial for determining difference. We're about to evaluate a child. We know it's culturally linguistically different. You need to detail that information. What about the social history? What about the family's history? What about their background and their experiences? Anything unusual? How different is it? We must use that information to get a sense of how different that child might be. Developmental history, obviously, there's some information there. But you also want to look at milestones. You want to know whether that child was progressing appropriately even in their own language, in their own culture, based upon what the parents might have observed themselves. The parents know pretty much what to expect in terms of what their child should have been able to do with walking, talking, toilet training, etc. So you get a sense as to whether or not there might have been any issues. Here the medical history is described as good, and it says health issues void of any conditions which might affect academic performance. Now, I'm kind of, sort of wondering, well, how do we know this if we haven't yet evaluated to find out what the academic performance is, other than people that are saying there are problems? We don't even know necessarily what some of the areas are and whether or not things might have been a part of that. A small history of chronic ear infections can cause auditory processing problems that are no longer evident by the time the child is in kindergarten, primarily because the ear has healed, the infections are gone, but the hearing loss that might have come from that, particularly high tone pitches, would not have been evident until the child begins to have phonological problems, phonological processing problems. So we want to know that. Illnesses, injuries, surgeries, anything that might have affected it would be important to know. And then the home and the community. Resides with his parents, yes. There are a total of 3 children living in the home, yes. Spanish spoken in the home, yes. That's all important. But what's the parent's socioeconomic status? What kind of other life experiences have occurred for this family? What are the parents' level of education? How well do they speak their native language as well as English? The language models that the child hears in the home are very, very important, even in the native language. So knowing these kinds of things helps us determine what the level of difference is, and I don't think the reports can shortchange this or really in any way minimize it and be effective. You've got to really detail it there. Now we have a good educational history here. Didn't attend a preschool program, attended local home school since enrolling in school. Rate of absence is above average, so there's a little bit of a concern. Not receiving special ed with initial evaluation, we know that. Continuing to pursue small group instruction. And then we have some loss testing here, which is great. And he's not reaching the science proficiency in any of the 4 measured areas. So scores range from 1 to 5. And 1 is beginner, 5 is indicating proficiency. So in speaking is 4, listening 3, reading is 1, writing is 2. Now, those scores are fairly typical. You notice that speaking is highest, then listening, then reading and writing. And that's sort of a typical kind of profile for children who are culturally linguistically different. Academically, they're lagging behind because the reading and writing aspects of language are symbolic forms of language which come generally after you've learned to speak it. So speaking is the easiest thing for children to pick up. So he's already at level 4, he's closing in on 5, and he's doing very well. Listening, the comprehension, lags a little bit behind the ability to just communicate and converse in the language. And then when we get to the symbolic aspects of encoding and decoding the language in written form, right, then that's even more abstract, and those tend to lag behind. So in a sense, this is great information and important to understand because it's sort of indicating the presence of cultural and linguistic kinds of issues already, even though we haven't yet evaluated. So there's classroom observation that's indicated here, which is good information and again good to look at. Helpful to do classroom observations relative to how other children who are English language learners are doing on the same types of assignments at the same time and so on. Then we have testing observations, again, where you're looking for qualitative information with regard to making sure the child understands, is able to put forth their best effort, comprehends the task itself, noting whether or not the child seems to be getting it in terms of the kinds of testing that are going on. In this case, Jacob was given the WISC and the CTOP, so we have additional CTOP scores, which the CTOP also uses scale scores like the WISC, so that makes it fairly easy. And we have those scores listed here, rapid letter naming, rapid digit naming, and so on, and so looks okay there. And then here are his KABC-II test results. So in addition, if I go back here, he was given actually not the entire WISC battery, but the WISC-IV coding subtest. He was given primarily the KABC-II battery here, which you can see. And we have the subtest values here. Now, again, ideally, you begin by evaluating the subtest scores, and I believe that that's exactly what was accomplished in this case. There's a summary that is provided here, and I'll read this to you first before we actually go on to look at the graph and the matrix itself. But acknowledging an unusual pattern of cognitive functioning strengths and weaknesses. I think perhaps what they mean is there's a lot of variability. You can see that he ranges from average to above average in several areas, yet in some areas he's really significantly weak and having difficulties, particularly short-term memory and or verbal knowledge and vocabulary. Although we'll have to double check that because that's the area that, again, I generally say if the language is in the in the gray shaded range on the band, probably don't want to be looking at that as an area of difficulty. They're relating the cognitive testing a little bit to the academic testing in terms of where the areas are here. And then an interesting sentence. Jacob may be exhibiting specific learning disorder, however, it's examiner's impression that his language background has contributed to deficiencies in his cognitive academic English vocabulary due to a lack of early exposure, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not appropriate to label a child as having a disability when a child's learning difficulties are the result of weaknesses associated with being an English language learner. This is exactly what I was talking about earlier in terms of making sure that when it comes to speech language functioning, or it comes to verbal ability, anything having to do with GC, language, cultural knowledge, that it be evaluated in comparison to other children of similar backgrounds. So in fact, going back up here, I think you could rule out the verbal knowledge and vocabulary. You'd really look at short-term memory as perhaps being an area that is a true weakness. Now, this summary probably should have come after looking at the scores with the Culture Language Matrix. If I drop the scores in the Culture Language Matrix, this is pretty much what they kind of look like here. You can see that tests that are, low in the upper left-hand corner, 93. But then we have, some scores like KABC-II Rover. He did extremely well there, and so he got a 120, and which is a skill score 14. And then KABC-II story completion, I got a 105. Now, story completion at that point, although it's a measure of GF, really probably by grade 3 at ages 5 and 6. Story completion is more of a GV task, so it's possible he did very, very well, primarily because it may not be tapping much into GF at this time. But for the most part, you see where the other scores kind of fall, and there's the CTOP scores are in there as well. The WISC-IV coding is entered. So looking at the entirety of the data, this is what the matrix looks like. If we look at the graph, then it looks like this. Now, in this case, once again, what we're trying to do is to say, all right, do the scores follow a declining pattern, and are the bars in the gray shaded area or higher? Well, we see somewhat of a declining pattern. This one, the medium high kind of cell and the high cell are following it. The low cell on the far left-hand side is following it. The low medium right next to it is kind of following it. But then we have other ones like the low low culture, high language, and then the moderate cell, not really following. It's way above, and the other one was way below. Another one is way above. The high culture and or moderate language is high. So culture language are present in this case, but they're not explaining these kinds of results. Where we would expect there to be more, say, average or more attenuated performance, we don't really see that. Seems to be doing pretty well. And then in some areas where we would see maybe some attenuation, but not very much, we in fact see a greater degree of attenuation. So in this case, again, using the Culture Language Interpretive Matrix, we would basically say that although culture and language are present and are contributing to Jacob's problems, they don't explain the results in their entirety. There appears to be more going on here than what we could say is simply a function of just culture and language. There seems to be something else that's present. And you know, the data just cannot be accounted for strictly by culture and language. And if that's the case, then we can say our results are valid. We acknowledge that culture and language are contributing to the problem, but don't explain it, and that there may well be a disability of some kind. In fact, you know, that was sort of noted. If we just go back to his scores here, you can kind of see that some of the areas in which he may have demonstrated some problems related to short-term memory, as it was pointed out, and to the crystallized intelligence. As noted, however, if I go back to the graph here, the crystallized intelligence is right here. This is where those scores are. This is why I think in the summary it was stated correctly in terms of, no, don't look at this as a speech-language problem. If you do not interpret GC or the VCI or the knowledge cluster or any type of verbal ability index or cluster in this way, you will likely qualify almost all ELLs as having a speech-language problem. And that, you know, obviously leads to quick overrepresentation. You can't do that. So GC, we're going to say, no, that actually is okay. I'm not going to worry about it, which means the only area in which he actually did demonstrate some difficulty happens to be the short-term memory. Visual processing, we're okay. Long-term storage and retrieval, we're okay. Fluid reasoning, we're okay. It really seems to be a short-term memory kind of difficulty. And in fact, in some of the observations that were noted, some of the things that were problematic can be explained quite well by the presence of a short-term memory problem. And in the analysis that was conducted, this is what you would attend to, linking the cognitive results with the academic say observations or academic deficiency observations, and saying that one can in fact explain the other. This is a necessary component of learning disability, and it's important that you make that connection to be able to say not only have I found a processing weakness of some kind, but that weakness is indeed empirically and or logically related to the area of academic weakness, and it serves as the explanatory mechanism for why that child is having trouble in that particular academic area. And you know, I think the inclusion of like this graph and the matrix itself helps to clarify these issues, particularly in a report, because it shows that an attempt was made to evaluate the impact of cultural influences and linguistic influences, and again, make the report very defensive. Now, one thing I might add in this case, if I had concerns, if you wanted to make it more compliant with IDEA, and that is to do some native language evaluation, I would again go back to what was low, and here you have short-term memory, number, recall, word order. I know that if Spanish were spoken in this case, you could actually re-administer these subtests in Spanish. At least the administration of them can be done in Spanish. I would also modify the administration and accept any responses from the child in Spanish and permit them to respond in Spanish and score them that way. The point would be not to generate numbers anyway, which is why violating the standardization the second time around is not a big deal. What I would be doing would be making sure that short-term memory is truly a problem, even when I know that the child can understand me better in their native language. And that's how you would be able to, again, validate the findings that have been generated here. And that's the only thing that I think might have been missing in this case. unless of course it was administered in Spanish, but I couldn't tell that it was, that I think would have helped or strengthened this particular evaluation, which was very good to begin with. So one little addition here would have been able to establish definitively that this is the area that the child has difficulties in, that there is a deficiency, that it's not due primarily to culture and language, and that special education services were absolutely warranted. And then finally, the third case, we have David here, and David is a little bit unusual as compared to the other cases here. He is 5½, but had not yet been attending school, so he had been at home. When it was sort of discovered that he was there, then he was told, you got to go to school, and father brought him in. Father is Hispanic and does speak English, although you notice here it says he has a thick accent. Well, clearly that means that the father was not raised in the United States, or at least was not raised in an environment where he heard English. So he developed an accent probably because he started hearing and or learning to speak English at a point probably beyond adulthood, certainly beyond the socialization level, which is usually 16 to 18, somewhere in there. It says mom was not involved, so we don't know what's going on, although she primarily speaks English and speaks some Spanish. Don't know how much. It would have been important to find out how much exposure there was to any English that was there, but it seems to be limited in some way. The father is very helpful, obviously, wants him to go to school, but I think has recognized that his son seems to have either some autistic-like, say, symptoms or characteristics, and or his development is really much that below of other children, as well as some emotional kinds of lags in emotional development, and these were probably the reasons why he hadn't actually brought him to school. On the other hand, the father may not have known that he was allowed to bring him to school, or that it was even required. You know, I must say, on a personal level, even after I had finished my Ph.D. in clinical psychology and I had begun to re-specialize in school psychology, it wasn't until I got into school psychology that I realized at the age of 35 that if I had a child with this level of difficulty, that he was still entitled to go to school. I actually thought, well, I have to take care of him on my own. I didn't know that the child actually had that right, because I'm not a lawyer. I don't, understand, or didn't at the time, what IDEA was all about, so I wouldn't have known that. So I don't think it's terribly unusual, but it's something to be aware of. So he was brought into school, and given where he was, the district felt we need to do an evaluation, which seems entirely appropriate at this point to really get an idea of what was going on. And as you can see here, he covered his head, hid under tables. He urinated in his pants 3 times during that. He didn't speak at all. He didn't attempt communication with the school staff. Seems to have no socialization skills. So obviously had a lot of delays going on here. Testing was attempted, but as you can see here, as it was noted, didn't go very far. The child himself seemed very uncomfortable and reticent to work with the female school psychologist in this case. And the lost links was attempted, obviously, to get the language proficiency out there. And he did seem to have some vocabulary, but not enough to even complete evaluations. So he was scored level 1 out of 5 with only 8 out of 37 responses correct. So, psychologist feels, well, maybe he can do better, but he's not cooperative, so it's difficult to really get anything out of him. And, there's not much you can do in that kind of a case. Observations were conducted, and I think that if you're not able to test or work directly with the child to engage in any kind of standardized testing, then you're going to have to resort to qualitative types of testing, more informal stuff, and a great deal of observations and or rating scales by parents, teachers, and other observers. So apparently, after coming to school for a while and getting used to the environment a little bit, he started to speak a little bit more. He talks about a television program that he watches. The school staff members haven't heard him speak in Spanish, although he had other kinds of issues. He didn't eat in school the first few weeks, and he didn't use utensils, puts his foot at the edge of the tray, then eats with his mouth. So clearly a lot of developmental delays going on here. His adaptive behavior skills seem very, very low, and he was still fearful of women. More information about the mother being in and out of prison for drugs, so we have to wonder any prenatal exposure to drugs would be an issue that would come up in this case. She did come to the conference to discuss his results, but he acted out. So again, what are the emotional concerns that are going on with the son and mother relationship? Father seems, more stable, more dedicated. And the boy was able to use the restroom at school, but it would only go if a male takes him. So he apparently urinates without consideration for where it goes, doesn't pull up his pants and or zip them. He waits for some help. So again, self-care skills seem very, very low. At home, his father, kind of helps him in this case. So the boy is still doing this and expecting it to be done on his own. He straightens out the resource room if anything's out of place, and now we see some kind of behaviors that maybe are along the autism spectrum. There's a little bit of order and structure that is necessary, or that's something that he likes. They're building some trust. A male school psychologist spending more time with him and hoping to build a relationship with him so that eventually maybe additional testing might actually be done. In this case, the summary was that, well, they think that he's probably autistic, but are not entirely sure. They don't have enough information to be able to make that determination. He's, being given every kind of accommodation or modification that they can at this time, helping him get adjusted to the school environment and make that kind of transition from the home and being able to bolster his adaptive behavior skills, obviously in terms of communication, self-care, and other types of physical and or gross motor skills. So this summary had these questions, and I'm going to go ahead and answer them here. They were part of the original summary that was posed rather than from readers. And the first question is, how do you evaluate an English language learner in such a severe situation? And I think I mentioned before that you're going to have to use a lot of qualitative types of indicators and informal testing. Play testing. You're going to work and see what they can or can't do from a developmental level. This is where bringing in things like, I don't know if you've ever heard of the California Ordinal Scales, which is based on Piagetian types of development. But it's simply a developmentally arranged task where you do things like you see how many blocks a child can stack. You show them the blocks, you play with them, you stack them yourselves to see how many they can get up. You probably do similar types of tasks on things like the Bailey scales of infant development. It might be helpful. The McCarthy scales might be helpful because he's really functioning fairly low. But you're not looking to do anything in a formalized, standardized kind of procedure. You're really looking to see what can that child do. Same things with the type of testing. You may want to get an occupational therapist in to see, can the child balance on one foot, hop on one foot, go up and down stairs, alternating with feet, the basic gross motor, fine motor kinds of things, and just get an idea. It's going to be a lot of criterion-referenced evaluation. I don't know that the other tool I might recommend, which is the it escapes me at the moment, but I'll come back to it. But it's criterion referenced, and it's just basically, can the child do this task? Can the child say this? How many letters does the child know? How many numbers does the child know? Things like that. There isn't much more you can do, but the idea is to just evaluate the level of current development. And because it's criterion referenced, it will allow you then to estimate whether or not these are comparable to other children with his particular background, that is, other English language learners. And I think that we've already seen there's plenty of evidence to suggest that he's not the typical English language learner. In terms of recommendations, in terms of helping him, I don't think you would do anything differently than you would do with any other child. You have to recognize that the rate of progress will be delayed even further by the presence of the cultural and linguistic differences. He's not going to learn things from the father that you would like him to learn when he goes home. He's going to learn the things that the father knows, not that the school would like him to know. So there's not anything really that can be done about that. And his learning capability is likely to be slower than the average child already, which means, again, it's going to be a very slow process, and there isn't much more that you can do. I think ultimately the best recommendation is simply to say, and I I will preface this by saying I know it's not practical and probably politically not expedient either, but it would be developmentally the correct thing to do, and that would be to allow the child to develop, receive as much instruction, and to learn as much as he possibly can in the native language so that he can communicate as effectively as possible with his father. This is a child whom we can already suspect, although we don't know for sure yet, but whom we already suspect is going to be limited in most skills across the board. This is not a child that we're going to be looking at being able to pass the state proficiency tests at any grade level at any point in time of his academic career. And the goal should be to create, a curriculum or academic program that allows this child to be as functional as possible, even if that means that he will be primarily speaking and or using the native language. Because that's where I think we need to get this child. That's where our responsibility should be. However, that said, I know that the child is going to have to take the state tests in English, and that people are going to hold other people accountable for his performance in English and so on, and that may not be feasible. But I think it is ultimately the right thing to do. If anything can be done, that's what ultimately should be done. Now, in looking at the testing, that could be done. Let's say you could give a KABC with this child in a little while, especially with some of the nonverbal kinds of things or less verbal things. If it were to happen, you might even do some of the other tests that I mentioned that are standardized, but probably your best bet's going to be using maybe the DOS. I think the DOS has great norms all the way down to age 2, and it might have been a better example than what I have here with the KABC. But it's the same basic idea. If you were to give it and able to give it in a standardized manner in English, you could then look at the scores and really help determine what's going on. If there was something truly reflective of a disability, then you might see it in the matrix looking like this with the scores, which are difficult to look at. But if you look at the graph would look like this. And what you see is, yes, there might be a decline in his scores down here relative to cultural and language. So yes, those scores are present, but they're still declining, and they don't actually reach the gray band, which is where the typical child of average ability or better with similar cultural linguistic background would be expected to score. So in other words, what you'd find is that if this child actually does have some type of pervasive cognitive disorder, such as autism, or he has some kind of global cognitive impairment as a result of autism or autistic-like features, or he has some just pervasive developmental disorder, this is what it would look like in terms of the graph. If they were within this gray area, then there would be nothing wrong. But we already know that there's probably going to be deficits, and those deficits would be across the board. Notice that there aren't these skills that come way up here on occasion, as we saw in Jacob's case. In this case, this is not a learning disability. This is a general learning disability, not a specific learning disability. In other words, all the abilities are being equally affected to one degree or another, and all of David's scores in this case are suppressed by the presence of cultural and linguistic variables, but they're also suppressed by the presence of something else that affects them in general, which would again conceivably be some type of general cognitive impairment in this case. And so if and when he could be tested, you could use this method to be able to say, yes, he probably has some kind of problem. And again, it wouldn't help you determine necessarily diagnostically what it would be, but it certainly would support the idea that this child's development is not due strictly to the effect of cultural and linguistic differences, but in fact is due to some other type of disability that is presenting itself in this case. Now, I want to apologize before I end here and get on to some questions in saying that I don't have an example here that sort of indicated that it was only culture and language. I think that I've mentioned it in terms of what it would look like so far, and in a large number of cases you will find that the child's scores will fall within that gray shaded area or be actually higher. And when that occurs, you've got to determine that the child's performance was due to cultural and linguistic influences only, or primarily, not only, I'm sorry, and that the results are invalid and cannot be interpreted any further. So that means you can't take the subtest scores and talk about them in terms of meaning. You can attach them to your report if you want. You can put a table if you want in your report, but you should not be describing results in your report at all. However, you can say one thing. And the one thing that you can talk about is if the child's scores fall within that gray shaded area or are higher, within the gray shaded area and or higher, then you know that the child is performing consistently with the pattern that has been established by research on other children who are non-disabled and of average ability or better themselves. That means then that this child, because his pattern is consistent with those children, is probably of average ability or higher and also non-disabled. And that's enough to be able to say, although I don't know what this child's capabilities are exactly, I can tell you that the results do not support the presence of a disability. And that would be enough to be able to say this is not a disability, we should not be qualifying for special education, does not support the presence of any kind of cognitive-based disability, and we need to move on. So you're able to make that decision and able to discuss it to that degree, which is sufficient for the purposes of making a decision at an IEP meeting where these issues would actually be discussed. And again, I apologize for not having an example of what that looks like, but I think it's fairly easy to imagine with just the scores declining in here. Like I said, it's going to happen probably in more cases than you would expect. It's not an unusual kind of pattern. It's probably a more typical kind of pattern. It's generally more unusual when the results do not tend to follow the pattern that has been expected or depicted by the gray shaded area. So that's pretty much it. The Culture Language Matrix, again, is designed to help you get over that obstacle. Are my results valid? And if they are, I will interpret, with the exception of GC, which I will interpret according to the matrix or to the graph here. Or my results are invalid, in which case I'm not interpreting. I might report the scores, but I'm not going to assign meaning to them because culture and language are the reasons why this child is performing the way that they're performing. So that means it's very likely the academic difficulties are due to cultural linguistic differences. Therefore, no disability in this case. And I can state probably that the abilities are average or better and no support for evidence of a disability. And again, that's sort of the general process in terms of the way things work. I know that may not be clear just in terms of a 1-hour presentation, but hopefully it is. And if not, some of the resources that are available to you might help clarify. And perhaps I'll get back to Indiana sometime soon to be able to provide additional instruction. So I'm going to move forward now to the question and answer session. I'm going to let the questions be given to me, and then I will respond to them in kind.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Ortiz. Now, these are the questions that we had from our first webinar with you, and we just wanted to run back through them for the folks that were part of that webinar who wanted to get clarity on the answers. So, what tools are must-haves for conducting your assessment approach?
I don't think there are any must-haves. I think you want to choose tools that are best suited for your purpose. It's easier to answer this question when you're talking about Spanish as being the second language. When it's not Spanish, it gets much more difficult. For example, a WISC-IV and a WISC-IV Spanish are great companion tools, and you could use those. You supplement the WISC probably with maybe the WJ-III because you're going to need some tests of auditory processing and long-term storage and retrieval. You can use the WJ-III and the Bateria-III. Again, English-Spanish parallel tests will work beautifully and covers pretty much all 7 broad ability areas. No need to supplement in most cases. The KABC has the English administration, has a Spanish administration. That could work as well, but again, you may need some supplementation from like the WJ-III or some other test. And the DOS itself also has Spanish administration. I don't think it matters when we're talking about Spanish in terms of what you're doing because you have so many to choose from. You can conduct what you need to do, and if it's in Spanish, the follow-up can be done in Spanish, you're okay. When you have another one, then I think You simply choose the best tool that you have and you supplement it as you may need to and go with that in English. And then best practice would dictate you call in an interpreter to come in and assist you with the native language evaluation component, or you find somebody who's bilingual who can give the test that you did in the areas in which you found were deficient. Now again, you're not going to be able to do that if you call in somebody and the language is something other than Spanish. So if it's in Swahili, Urdu, Arabic, Vietnamese, you're more likely going to have to resort to getting an interpreter to come in, translate the test on the fly, or at least train them to be able to translate it with you, and go from that point of view. Now remember, when you're doing that, it's not a problem in terms of worrying about scores or violating standardization or translation issues. What you're trying to do is simply have that person help you determine if these types of tasks are given in the native language, do we see the same type of difficulty from that child? That's all you're really trying to answer. So the scores don't matter. You don't even have to generate scores. You're simply trying to validate the areas that were deficient from before as being deficient now. From that approach, like I said, then you really have the option to do anything that you need. There isn't anything that has to be a specific must-have, but that's about the best I think I can give you in terms of recommendations.
Alrighty, thanks. Let's move on to our next question. What is your opinion of using Rosetta Stone for English instruction?
Well, my opinion is that the Rosetta Stone is a program that's geared toward conversational language. That's it. Schools are not just trying to teach conversational language. If that's all that was expected of you, you wouldn't even be talking to me, because all of your kids would reach, most of your kids would reach, level 4 or 5 on the lost links, and you'd be done. You'd say, look, this kid is conversational. So the real problem is that while it's effective and can be effective in helping people to learn how to speak the language, the problem is it's not content-based. And the type of English instruction that children should be getting from day one is and needs to be content-based if it's going to be effective in any degree. So can you do it? Sure. But is it going to help the child in much of any way? Not really. So I don't recommend it. I don't think it's good use of instructional time. The instructional time, even for English, should be using vocabulary that relates to the curriculum. The child will learn English, believe me, speaking to his or her friends, out on the playground, during recess, watching TV, doing homework. All of that conversational stuff will come automatically. You don't need the Rosetta Stone for that. But the content-based instruction, the key academic vocabulary, must come from instruction that's taking place in the classroom during this period of time in which you might be doing this kind of instruction, which wouldn't even help. So I'd say forget about using it. Go back and give the child key content vocabulary that is not included in that type of program, so that the child can maintain some semblance of connectedness or access to the curriculum, so when they get back into that classroom, the words that they listen to and hear are not being heard for the first time.
Okay, thank you. And our next question from the participants. What approach do you take when interpreting achievement scores for an ELL student if the C-LIM shows that the cognitive scores are valid?
This is a great question, and it actually relates to something that I get asked all the time, which is, why don't we have Culture Language Interpretive Matrix for achievement tests? And the reason is this. The achievement tests, by and large, are different than cognitive tests for one big reason. An achievement test is generally measuring some type of academic skill that is a manifest skill, not a latent skill, not a latent ability. So for example, spelling. How many tests do you need to give to determine whether somebody can spell in English? The answer is 1. How many tests of computation and math do you need to give to figure out if somebody can do computation? 1. It's not necessary to do more than that, because the test itself is measuring exactly what you wanted to test. It does not change in terms of what it's measuring just because you give it to an English learner. Now, it does change in terms of, well, if I give you a spelling test in English and you don't do very well, I know you can't spell well in English. That doesn't mean you can't spell well in your native language. However, in the vast majority of cases, we're working with kids who are not getting educated in their native language. They're not being trained in their native language. So we wouldn't expect them to be able to spell or read or do math in the native language. We'd expect them to be able to do it in English because that's where we're showing them. So testing and achievement scores really serves as a baseline of where the child is. And there's no need to go on beyond that. We simply accept that this is where the child is. The question becomes this. If the cultural language shows that the cognitive scores are valid, then it means that the academic scores are not due, and academic deficiencies are not due simply to cultural linguistic issues, that there is a disability there. So you must make that connection in exactly the same way you would if the child wasn't even an English learner. Do the cognitive scores explain the academic difficulties? That's a question that holds true regardless of the child's background. So the academic scores in the case of ELLs, as well as in the case of children who are native English speakers, simply serves as your baseline. It tells you, look, this is what the child can do right now, and this is all they can do. And I think that's great information so that you can take the instruction and bring it to that level, because that's where it is appropriate. That's where you need to begin. That's where the next type of instruction has to start from. So it tells you where to go. It tells you what he or she can actually do. And are we worried about, well, maybe they could do it in another language or not? No, I think that the evaluation would have already indicated that, especially from a cognitive point of view. And if you already know from the child's background that they have been educated in their native language, then you're not likely to see any difference in terms of testing in the native language or not. If they have been instructed in the native language, you would see a big difference if, of course, they've just arrived to the United States. So unless they're in those kinds of exceptional and strange circumstances, you take the achievement scores, you take them at face value and say, here's where we need to improve upon because here's where the child is currently functioning. Use them as the baseline, use them as a standard for moving ahead in instruction and or intervention, and you link deficiencies relative to the cognitive scores that were obtained. Again, assuming that they were validated as being true.
Okay, great. Let's check out another question. What areas should always be assessed for language proficiency? What language proficiency tests are most recommended?
Well, I think you want to evaluate in areas that you're evaluating currently. You certainly have like the lost links, which will do speaking, listening, reading, writing, you know, and those are the four main areas. You see a typical kind of pattern going on there. I think what is most important is to understand that, for example, if you're using the lost links or those types of tests, you're getting a measure of BICS only, that is basic interpersonal communication skills. Now, a child can score a 5 on that and still have difficulty when you go to evaluate in terms of cognitive tests. Just because they speak the language well, that is English well, does not mean that they think in English well. Does not mean that they are developmentally comparable to native English speakers. So even after you've exited a child from ESL or ESOL services, does not mean they should be treated as native English speakers. IDEA permits that. It says, hey, the kid is no longer receiving those services. You can just evaluate in English. Yes, you can, but that does not mean your expectations of performance should be based on native English speakers. That's not the appropriate comparison group. It should always remain an English learner type of group. And that's where the Cultural Language Matrix, I think, is particularly helpful, and why you can evaluate in English and still examine the types of scores. So in terms of what language proficiency tests are most recommended, I don't know that there are some that are better than others. You know, it depends on what purpose and for what, you know, usage. If you want a nationally norm test, the Woodcock Munoz Language Survey is a good test for that. It gives you a BIC score. It gives you a CALP score too, but the CALP score is a little different. You know, with English learners, we wouldn't expect CALP to even develop in English until they're in 11th grade. So it's not telling us a whole lot. I think that scores are more important important than what test is being used. If you have a language proficiency test that can give you growth scores, if you can give you one that can give you comparisons to native English speakers as well as comparisons to English language learners, those would be ones that would be ideal. Do you have that right now? I don't think so. I don't think there are very many that give you growth scores. Maybe the Woodcock English Language Survey. I don't think any of them have comparisons or norm samples that are appropriate for both native speakers of the language or bilingual students and those that are native English speakers. So you're kind of limited in this capacity. But I think that most any test will give you at least speaking, reading, writing, listening, and what you're looking for is just where are they. It gives you a crude idea of where they are developmentally, and until we have better language tests, it's probably okay for the most part.
Okay, great. Our next question, I'm a novice at understanding how EL students learn language. What book would you recommend to help me better understand their needs? Oops, I think we just need our audio.
Sorry, I'm back. I think that the book that is listed here, although again it's getting a little bit dated, I know it's 7 years old. Unfortunately and sadly, the literature though doesn't change that much in this area, so it really is still somewhat up to date. But assessment of cultural and linguistically diverse students, a practical guide that I co-wrote with Robert Rhodes and Hector Ochoa, excuse me, and published by Guilford in 2005. It is really a great book because it has chapters on a lot of these issues that are independent that you can read and really get a grasp on. Things like acculturation and acculturative learning, language and language development and language assessment, cognitive assessment and cognitive development, academic evaluation is covered in there, special education, overrepresentation, language development, all these things are part of it. So I think it's still a good book to get a good idea in terms of where to begin and where to go. The only other thing I would recommend in terms of the Culture Language Matrix is the Chapter 5 from the Essentials of Cross-Battery Assessment. The second edition is currently available. The third edition will come out in end of January, early February, hopefully. And again, Chapter 5 in that book will cover these issues, I think, very well, and cover issue of the use of the Cultural Language Matrix, Interpretive Matrix, which will have a new version as well, so it's probably good catching up. I actually think if you're a complete novice, getting Essentials second edition right now is your best bet, so that by the time the third one comes out, it wouldn't be a big jump in terms of understanding, because it really does jump from the second edition to third edition, and I'm thinking most people who are familiar with the second edition won't have any problem with the third edition. People who are brand new to it might find actually reading the second edition first better and easier, and then going to the third edition.
Okay, thanks. All right, our next question was about a particular student. Do you have any suggestions for evaluating students with severe language disorders, language scores in the 50s while unit equals 85 through outside testing? Specifically, a second grader whose primary language is Spanish and testing in Spanish shows a significant delay in language as well. He is identified with a language disorder. When is it appropriate to evaluate for a specific learning disability?
Well, there's a lot of questions going on here. I think I mentioned before in terms of evaluation for, I think it was David who had the significant global cognitive impairment. I would, same thing there in terms of qualitative information, playing or task-oriented kinds of analysis and evaluation, developmental kinds of tasks. And if you can do standardized testing, they show the unit here, that's even better, and that's perfectly okay. In fact, he shows exactly that kind of pattern. Unit, which has a lot of nonverbal and low language, low culture kinds of scores, is an 85, and yet his language scores are in the 50s. So you're probably looking at exactly that kind of problem, which is a speech-language issue. The Cultural Language Matrix, can discern a speech-language problem by showing that the scores that are more highly linguistically and culturally loaded are the ones in which the child scores even further below the expected range. But when they're low in terms of culture and language, like you're showing in the unit here, they're more in the average range. So in fact, I think what was done here is probably what I would recommend anyway. When is it appropriate to evaluate for specific learning disability? You really need to give the child sufficient opportunity to learn. If you're talking about a child who's only been here 1, 2, 3 years, that's difficult because they've just learned English and haven't even had a chance to actually learn just yet. You know, so I would probably be hesitant to do anything between K through 3. But by about 3rd, 4th grade, I think you can probably legitimately look at issues of specific learning disability. Before that, you can look at issues of general learning disabilities, such as cognitive, pervasive cognitive disorders or developmental disorders. But for specific learning disability, I'd say around the end of 3rd grade, early 4th grade, you can start to look at it from there. I don't think that would be inappropriate. Again, depending upon what you know about the child, what their background is, and so forth.
Great, thank you. And I believe this is our last question from the participants. Are there instances where results are considered to be interpreted with caution according to the C-LIM? It appears that all results provide valid information.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this previously. The examples that I showed didn't have one where it shows that the results are actually invalid. Again, there is no interpretation with caution other than the GC that I spoke about previously. If your results are valid, interpret. If your results are not valid, you can't interpret. Again, with the caveats that I mentioned and with the inferences that can be made. But in fact, what will happen is you will evaluate children, and I would say a good number of them are going to show scores that are in that grade band or higher, and you're done. That's where you would say, no, the results are not valid, I'm finished, I'm ending it. And it happens much more frequently than you might expect. Unfortunately, like I said, in this case, I didn't have an example to show you of that, so it wasn't part of the case studies. But yes, it does occur, and in those cases, there is no, again, caution. You simply do not interpret your results because the results are invalid, above and beyond what I've already said is permissible. So that's pretty much it. Like I said, hopefully next time I'll have an example of that, and it'll make more sense and it'll be more clear.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Ortiz. We appreciate you spending your time with us and sharing your knowledge. And we'd also like to thank our viewers for joining our webcast and taking time to learn with us. And if you are looking for additional resources, please visit our website at www.indianaeerc.org. All right. Thanks again.